Today's Gospel reading is from the Gospel of John, chapter 2, and it's the story of when Jesus goes into the temple and basically goes a bit off the rails. Starts flipping tables and driving out the money changers and gets really angry about what's going on. And this is a really interesting passage for a few reasons. When we usually talk about Jesus, we like to concentrate on things like love and compassion and kindness, the way Jesus welcomes everybody. And it's quite a soft image. We like Jesus to be this loving, kind, gentle person. Like you'd put a picture of Jesus on the wall of a nursery with him surrounded by little children, or maybe with a lamb at his feet. And that's the Jesus that we like. But the Jesus in today's gospel reading is quite different. He gets really angry, and he somehow has a homemade whip. So a bit of context. The temple in Jerusalem was the most important place for Israel to worship. It was where God dwelt. The temple was where God was among them. So it's the most holy place, the most special place. And the way the temple was laid out was kind of like concentric rings, one inside another. And the very central ring was the most holy of holy places. That was where God was. And so the next rings out would be sort of less close to the most holy place. So you'd have the parts where the sacrifices were made, you'd have the rings where the Israelites came to worship and pray, and the very outer ring was called the court of the Gentiles, and that was where people who were not Israelites, the people who were Gentiles, that was where they were allowed to come and to be as close to God as they were allowed to get. And this outer ring, the court of the Gentiles, is where the money changers and the stalls were set up doing temple business. Now, for the temple to function, people needed to be able to buy animals to sacrifice. They needed to be able to exchange their Roman currency coins for Jewish coins. And so there was a lot of business that just needed to happen, and that was part of everyday temple stuff that went on. So the money changers and all these stalls in the Gentile courtyards, it's not that they were doing anything wrong in and of itself. It's not that they were necessarily ripping people off or extorting. So these various stalls would have actually been providing a really vital service, so that the Israelites who had come to the temple would be able to fully take part and to fully worship, to offer sacrifices, to do everything that they wanted and needed to do. So why does Jesus get really angry? I think for the people who were there, who were watching the scene unfold, they probably would have thought Jesus had gone a bit off the rails, because he starts flipping tables. He's got a homemade whip that he starts using. And you can only imagine the chaos and the shock and the uproar as everything goes flying and people are running. And it's a real scene of chaos. And so why does Jesus do this? It's basically the only example we have in the Gospels of Jesus getting really angry about something. And so it's curious, and it's worth reflecting on why that might be. Now, one explanation, I think, could well be that it was about access. So, as I said, all this trading was happening in the outer court, where the Gentiles were allowed to be. And so the fact that this was the only space where the Gentiles could worship, it was the space where they were as close to the Holy of Holies as they could possibly get, and yet for them it wasn't able to be a space of prayer, because it was taken up with these people buying and selling and doing business. And so I think the fact that any Gentiles who wanted to come and worship and pray were effectively being blocked from doing that. I think that may well be one of the major reasons why Jesus gets so angry, because there would have been people who genuinely wanted to come and worship, Gentiles who believed that God was the one God and they wanted to come and be part of that. But when they arrived, the place where they were supposed to be able to pray was not available. It was just full of shouting and selling and animals all over the place. And so they had no access. And in the Old Testament, the Torah specifies that this outer court of the Gentiles should be where Gentiles are able to pray and worship. And yet it seems that in the temple at this point, that just isn't the case. That space is not being respected as being a place for the Gentiles. And so I think that's probably a really good reason why Jesus got really angry, because Jesus wants people to be able to access God and to be able to worship and pray. And so in doing what he does, in flipping the tables and driving them all out, he's effectively saying this place needs to be respected for the Gentiles. This place is supposed to be for them, even though they're not allowed in any further, whereas the Israelites would be. They are allowed here, and this space is important for them. So, in a way, his anger is an anger of desiring people to have the access to God that they want. It's about respecting people who are seeking and searching. Yeah, it's dramatic and it's kind of shocking, and it goes against this idea of Jesus that we really like and talk about most of the time. This is an anger that is driving towards allowing God to be accessed by all people. So that is one explanation as to why we have this story of Jesus just destroying the place. Another interesting thing to consider is about the actual temple building itself. So, of course, as I said, for the Israelites, it was the most important place. It was where God dwelt among them. Jesus says, if you demolish this temple, I will raise it up again in 3 days. And they all laugh at him and they say, how on earth could you do that? Because took like decades to build this temple, and you think you can do it in 3 days? I don't think so. But of course, from our perspective, with hindsight, we know that Jesus wasn't actually talking about the building of the temple, but he was talking about himself as the temple. So when he says he'll raise it in 3 days, he's referring to himself at the resurrection. So Jesus is pointing towards a new temple. It's almost as if he's saying God is being relocated. Yes, up until now, God has been here in the temple, but actually, I've come to change all that. And that's part of the amazingness of Jesus being a human, because he brings that connection between the divine and humanity and brings them together in a way that had never been before. And so Jesus is trying to tell people that from now on, God won't just be in the Holy of Holies, in the center of the temple. From now on, God is here. God is in the person standing in front of you. Jesus was getting them to look at him and saying, I am the temple. God is within me. Everything has changed. And for us today, we know that that also applies to us as Christians. We are now the temple. God isn't restricted to a place anymore. Instead, God is now going to be within people. Jesus is saying that God is no longer going to be distant, but is going to be completely intimate within us, part of us, among us as human beings. It's an entire paradigm shift in the understanding of our relationship with God. So even though the people standing there watching the chaos and listening to what Jesus is saying, even though they probably did not understand what he was talking about, what Jesus is saying is that Jesus himself was the temple. He was the location of God's glory. And so we know that when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD by the Romans, we know that that wasn't the end of God being among us, because this paradigm shift had taken place. And it may be that part of the reason why Jesus turned everything upside down and caused the chaos that he did was because he was trying to get people to see that this was happening, that God was being relocated from this boundaried small place where hardly anyone could have access to instead being within Jesus and then within us through the Spirit. God is being brought into the world in a fundamentally new and intimate way. So again, it's about access. Jesus is making God accessible to everyone. And I think all of this points us towards an important consideration. So if God is no longer in the temple, but if we are now the temple, God is within us, then that surely has quite far-reaching implications for pretty much everything. It should impact what we buy, what choices we make, how we talk about others behind their backs. It should have impact on how we vote, on what we hold as important, on what we think about offering aid to international countries, on how we can support each other locally and even across the world. It's actually a deeply political thing to believe that God lives within people, because that then surely makes people the most important thing, and we should be striving to do all we can to respect and to nurture and to build up one another as holy temples of God. And I think we should also bear in mind that God isn't restricted anymore to physical places. And, it can be tempting for some of us to perhaps get overly attached to buildings. And I'm not saying that churches and other religious buildings aren't important. They are, they certainly are. But we need to be careful where we put our priorities and what we value the most, because it's the people who are the temple now. And so with all this in mind, I think perhaps you feel that it won't make much difference, or perhaps you're not sure what you could do to really live this knowledge out. But I think just starting with some really deep reflection about what we really value, and do we appreciate that other people and ourselves are now temples of God? How does that affect everything we do and think and say? How does that affect the way we live in the world? That has potential to have a massive impact on everything. Although I would not, of course, advocate going wild and tipping tables and causing chaos in churches or temples or wherever you go. But I think to challenge ourselves and to challenge each other on what do we hold dear, and are we doing all we can to both allow and encourage access to God, and are we doing all we can to treasure each other as holy temples, as the places of God's glory? That's the challenge. You are a temple of God, which is incredible, but so is literally everybody else. And what do we do with that? How do we live that knowledge? Jesus in the temple, getting angry. He's got his homemade whip. It's a bit of an Indiana Jones image, to be honest. But I think it's shocking, and it makes us pay attention and sit up and notice. Again, maybe that's partly why he did it, just to get people to pay attention. But it's good that we have this story. It's good that we have Jesus getting angry and being really passionate about people being able to access God, because it sets an example for us of what is important. I'm advocating that we think really deeply and allow that thinking to actually change how we behave, because really that's the point. of everything. That's the point of faith, that's the point of Christianity. How do we allow this knowledge to impact on us, on what we do and say, and how we are with God and each other? So